After a day's travel up the mountain, we reached a summit. The wind blew harder and it was much colder, and it also had a different smell and feel to it. Something in the wind made me feel a little lightheaded. I didn't know if it was my illness returning or a spirit. The snowfall had quickly become a storm, the higher we ascended. Here the snow had tapered off somewhat, but the blowing snow had slowed us down considerably. I was now in front, helping Taliriktug lead the dogs up the perilous mountain path. At times we had to literally pull the dogs through the snow, for fear that they might lie down and fall asleep. We stopped on a small plateau, just large enough for the sled, the dogs, and us. The dog team lay down on a patch of gray rock, where the wind had cleared the snow away. The animals huddled together for warmth, hiding their cold snouts under their curled-up bodies. I looked out over the escarpment. Beyond our isolated plateau was a land of mountains, hanging mist and blowing snow as far as I could see. A winding ribbon of turquoise water ran through the gray-black rock faces, stealing the attention and the natural light. Gentle slopes rose up from the winding river and then jutted up dramatically to snow-dotted peaks. I followed Taliriktug down a narrow sloping ledge and into a cave just below the plateau. It faced out over the side of the mountain, hidden from anyone who didn't know it was there. But as Taliriktug led me through its entrance, I could understand how someone could choose to live in it, if they wanted to lead an autonomous life. I assumed that this was our final destination, rather than another rest. A damp, putrid smell struck my nostrils as I passed through the rock portal. Taliriktug didn't seem to mind it. Balancing himself on tumbled boulders, he was clambering down to a sloping rock floor. All around us tunnels branched off in different directions. The drip, drip, drip of water surrounded us. I noticed water running down the walls and suspected it was partly due to the warmer interior air meeting the frozen air. Closer to the entrance, sheets of ice covered the walls. We passed several pools of water being fed by milky white stalactites along the ceiling. An ever-present wind blew from deep within the catacombs. There had to be a source of underground heat, because the wind was tempered enough to make the catacombs livable. It made a strange sound that seemed to come not from one particular point, but all around us. It was similar to the sound made by blowing through a large hollow pipe. A higher-pitched flute sound punctuated it at random intervals, and perfectly harmonized with the unending, low bass sound. I both feared and was enchanted by this haunting melody. Torches had a ghostly, iridescent glow along the ceiling of the deep cavern we traversed. They flickered and didn't go out as the wind passed over them. We walked past cave drawings, some beautifully painted. They depicted groups of people hunting antlered animals. They carried what looked like spears. Some carried bows with nocked arrows, ready to fire at the animals. It seemed to me that these paintings depicted Taliriktug and his people in hunting parties. Deeper, there was another depiction of a group of people, and then a much larger and more elaborate sketch, with a taller figure at the center of the group. It was difficult to decipher the image, but I assumed this figure was a visitor to the community because of its prominence. As I looked at the two separate images, everything began falling into place. This was a history of the community. The caves served as a type of museum for their collected lives. As Taliriktug grabbed a lit torch from the wall, it occurred to me that someone had to keep these torches lit. I suspected that he was taking me to see that someone, perhaps the large figure depicted in the cave painting. The pictures continued as we moved farther into the cave. Ink-line drawings were drawn over what looked like chiseled marks in the rock itself. Unlike the paintings, the etching and the line drawings were much more rudimentary. The trunks of animals were square rather than rounded like their painted counterparts. The marks had faded over time, but within those lines I could complete the shapes of people, a herd of animals, and on the opposite wall, a drawing of two groups of people. One group bore what looked like weapons, and they chased an unarmed group. In the wake of the attackers, bodies lay strewn on the ground, depicting injuries or death. "Ari," Taliriktug said, struggling with the word. He pointed to a fungus growing in an area of the floor, and indicated by moving his head along with facial expressions that I was not to touch it, or eat it, or even inhale the air around it. I paid careful attention and acknowledged his warning. We passed several cold hearths, a second sign of either recent or current habitation. Taliriktug led me into a tunnel where a light source reflected off a pool of water, casting dark, randomly dancing patterns on the opposite wall. I was now convinced that we were not alone. My body tensed and my senses remained alert. My steps were steady and slow. I jumped when Taliriktug unexpectedly called out a name. Engekuk! Engekuk! I heard a stirring farther down the tunnel, then a silhouetted figure stepped into a doorway that I hadn't really noticed. I could make out a few features. The face, although dimly lit, was the face of an older man. A gray and white beard rested on his chest. He wore a torn, tan-colored habit, with a rope tied around his waist and a crucifix depending from that. Taliriktug, Maingahpak, please come in. I followed Taliriktug nervously, staying close to my companion, who during the last several days had shown nothing but concern for my well-being. I took some comfort in the trust that I felt toward Taliriktug. I considered him my protector and a friend. The figure backed away from the doorway, and shadows once again danced across the wall. I noted that their seemingly random patterns were synchronous with the cave harmonics carried by the constant breeze blowing through the tunnels. He led us into a larger chamber. In the center of the room lay a hearth, its embers glowing orange between dark cinders. On the right side of the room was a scribe's table, containing the instruments used to take measurements and other strange mathematical devices. I glanced at one of the many open parchments on its surface and recognized a liturgical calendar. I identified Lent and Easter. The large figure sat down on a natural seat of flat rock. He still towered above both of us. "Please be seated," he said to me. "I am Dionysius." Taliriktug walked around the hearth and sat to the right of Dionysius. The shimmering heat and smoke from the hearth gave them an ethereal quality. "And who are you?" he asked me. "My name is Ari. Ari of Marsen," I said. "Welcome, Ari," he said. "Welcome to my heaven on earth." He boomed, though his voice still maintained its welcoming tone. I scanned the chamber. Although he had made a comfortable home in this rugged setting, it was hardly heaven. The walls dripped with moisture into pools of green and sapphire blue. The wind whistled through the tunnels at varying pitches, the worst being an occasional squeal. I failed to see how this environment could be confused with utopia. It was damp, dark, and lonely. I couldn't quite place his accent. "How long have you been living here?" I asked, hoping to lead the conversation to his homeland. "It's been so long that I can't remember," Dionysius replied. "My reason for coming here does not require me to keep track of time. I come here to find solace, so that I may be closer to God. For that, eternity does not seem like a long time." "But you keep a calendar on your table." "A relic from my past, nothing more." "You are in this foreign land alone?" I asked in disbelief. "How could someone relegate himself to such a place?" "Yes, I am a Culdee. My order is sworn to serve through hardship and solitude." I nodded without really knowing what he meant. I had never heard the name Culdee, but I guessed that the order was Christian. All Norsemen had heard of Christians, and I, with my Viking past, was no exception. The hearth burned hot. I felt the tickle of perspiration trickling down my face. As I removed my outer clothing, I noticed a change in Dionysius's face, and then everything made sense to me. Taliriktug's rescue, the reverential treatment I received from his people. They all had mistaken the habit I wore for membership in a religious order. The fact that my habit was of a different color from Dionysius's didn't seem to matter. "Ari, you should have told me you are a monk," Dionysius said, putting his palms together. I didn't think to," I stammered. "Of course, you would not have known because of my outer clothing." I didn't know why I lied. It was not out of contempt for Dionysius's belief, but the truth did not fit into my immediate needs. "Your order, the Culdees. I have heard of them, but I do not know much about them," I said. "We are an Irish order." Irish, I thought. That's what his accent is. "We believe that in order to find God, we must have faith in God. So, to exercise our faith, We travel and endure hardship, hunger, and the elements. It is our suffering that gives meaning to our faith. There have been many such trips," he continued. "St. Brendan was said to have held mass on the back of a whale during one of his journeys. I ended up here. By the grace of God, I've been provided for by Taliriktug and members of his tribe. They provide me with furs and help me with finding food. This allows me to pray and meditate. I am grateful to them and to God for granting this to me. I originally planned to join my brethren south of here, but I became settled here and realized that I didn't want to be part of a community anymore, so I decided to stay. But I have questions to ask of you. Tutega, who was the other Thule, has provided me with some information about your ship. All aboard her, or at least the ones that we found, have perished." "Yes," I hesitated, fearing that Dionysius would implicate me somehow as the cause of the disaster that killed the crew and set the Nar adrift. "Engakak!" someone yelled from behind us. Dionysius, along with Taliriktug, stood and ran out of the chamber. I could hear muffled voices in the other chamber, including Dionysius's, but I didn't understand what any of them were saying. They returned with a limp human figure cradled in Taliriktug's and another Thule's arms. Dionysius led them into another part of the cave. I followed them to see who they had brought in, expecting it to be a Thule, either injured or suffering from being caught out in the snowstorm. It took all 3 men to lift the figure onto a fur-covered rock in the shape of a bed. Once they stepped away from the body, I saw the face within the fur-lined parka. It was Tory. My emotions were mixed. I was happy to see Tory alive. He'd been a good shipmate during the trip. But if he woke up and saw me, my assumed identity would be compromised. "He seems to be suffering from exhaustion and exposure to the elements," Dionysius whispered. "He needs to rest if he is to recover at all." He turned to Tutega and barked an order. Tutega disappeared into the tunnel. Dionysius began inspecting Tory's fingers and toes for frostbite, I assumed. Tory's fingertips around the nails looked purple and bruised. "His name is Tory. He is a member of my crew," I said, fearing that at any moment he would open his eyes and expose me. "Do you think he will survive?" "My knowledge of medicine is only as much as is required by my religious order," Dionysius said. "We will have to trust in the will of God." It is the will of God that bothers me, I thought. For now I decided not to do anything, but I began devising a plan to rid myself of this new threat. I decided not to take my eyes off of Tory. The closer I was to him, the closer I could keep watch on him. "I will care for Tory as well," I said. "After all, he is my crewmate." As I watched Tory lying helpless on the bed, I thought the best way to silence him was by killing him without leaving evidence of the murder. My options were limited. The only weapons at my disposal were rocks and heavy objects that would certainly leave marks on his body. Dionysius, with his knowledge of medicine, must be 100% convinced that Tory had died because of his weakened state. I volunteered to take the first watch, feeling too agitated to sleep anyway. As I sat next to his bed, various plans flashed through my mind. They branched off into other plans, and if I reached a dead end, the course of my thinking brought me back to a previous idea. The same question arose over and over again in my mind. How could I silence Tory? I purposely didn't use the word murder, avoiding that made killing him so much easier. However, I did find the actual act of silencing him difficult, because I didn't feel malice toward him. He hadn't harmed me in any way, nor had I felt threatened by him at any point. Nevertheless, he was now a threat to me. At this point, I began rationalizing his death and transforming my fear and uncertainty into motivation. In this harsh land, it was the way of things. The weak must succumb to the will of the strong. As I sat there staring around at the rock room and the burning hearth and the flickering flame of the torch, my mind momentarily quieted. Then it began racing again. To take a human life was so simple an act, and yet it was the most difficult thing to do. My eyes focused on the books inserted into every crevice and alcove in the walls, but I wasn't really looking at them. My mind was still on the present problem. The books only served as a focal point for my thoughts, and then the thought struck me. If Dionysius had knowledge of giving and keeping life, then perhaps this knowledge could be turned to cause death. I leapt to the first book my eyes fell on. It's such a simple plan, I thought, as I leafed through the pages and scanned the neatly written words and carefully drawn illustrations. The medicines that healed in the proper hands could also kill. There must be some elixir or potion that I could mix up that would leave little evidence. I put the book down and picked up another book and another, partly looking for either an image or words that struck me as familiar, and partly hoping Odin would guide my murderous hand. I reached high above my head, groping within the niche I'd been exploring. The tips of my fingers brushed the spine of a book, and I stood on tiptoe to wiggle it from its jagged rock shelf. I misjudged its weight. It fell from my hand and hit my head, then dropped to the floor. Pages fell out of the book and floated to the ground, whirling over and over of their own accord. My eye fell on half of a familiar illustration as I reached for the loose sheets of paper. I picked up the book lying face down on the floor and flipped it over, then slipped the loose page containing the partial illustration in next to its neighbor. I confirmed the image that I'd glimpsed. It was the fungus Taliriktug had warned me about at the cave entrance. Although I couldn't read Latin, the picture was unmistakably of the same fungus. I felt a sense of calm that slowly changed to a macabre excitement. The beauty of this plan was that Dionysius would not be any the wiser, because the poison would be perceived as being naturally caused. I didn't know how long it would take to affect Tory, but I thought the sooner I started with my plans, the better. Of course, this didn't guarantee his demise, but in his weakened condition my chances of success were good, and besides, I had very little choice. I didn't have time to study Dionysius's books, and I couldn't risk Tory waking and recognizing me. This act had to be decisive and as immediate as possible. I heard rustling on the fur-covered rock bed. Tory was moving as if he were in a dream state. His legs kicked off the fur covering his body. I walked over and found myself picking up the cover and placing it over him again. I found this act surprising, considering that moments earlier I decided to silence Tory to prevent him from exposing me. The thought did cross my mind to take the fur and bunch it up over his face. Beads of sweat had sprouted all over his forehead and chest. As I laid the cover on top of him again, I touched his clammy skin. Perhaps I didn't have anything to worry about after all. Tory's death may be inevitable without my intervention. "How is our patient doing?" Dionysius asked from somewhere behind me. Still leaning over Tory, I answered, "This is the only time that he's stirred, Father." "Please get some rest, Father Marson. I can watch over your shipmate." I watched as Dionysius placed a sack around Tory's neck. He looked up and smiled at me. "It is filled with herbs collected by the Thuls every fall," he said, as if reading my questioning thoughts. I retreated and walked up the rock corridor to the entrance of the cave. The snow had stopped, and the sky was clearer than I'd seen it since my arrival in this frozen wasteland. The stars were so bright that in some places it was hard to distinguish one star from another. The northern star, which I recognized, shone brightly overhead. Distant howls bit into my senses, along with the stinging touch of the cold Arctic breeze. For some reason, I wasn't tired. My senses were fully alert. My head was clear, and my pulse was strong. The moment that Tory was carried through that door, I noticed a calm discomfort rising inside of me. I was forced to remain calm so I wouldn't alarm Dionysius and Taliriktug, and forced to conceal the discomfort that at any moment I may be found out. It wasn't so much the consequences of sinful thoughts and actions, but the guilt of those sinful thoughts and actions. It was about not being able to live with the self-torment of knowing that you had or planned to sin. Of course, this applied only if you were a believer. I know that my reason was the fear of being revealed, fear of the repercussions of my actions. It certainly wasn't fear of the afterlife or punishment of any kind. If that were the case, then every Norseman who plundered the Christian churches for gold and gems would have need to worry. I returned to the cave, and immediately the warm breeze hugged me. I shivered with delight. I looked down at the approximate location of the mushroom-like fungus that Taliriktug had pointed out to be poisonous if inhaled. The white top shone pale in the moonlight. I reached down and carefully picked the fungus from the ground, all the while turning my head so I didn't accidentally inhale its poison. I planned how I could administer the poison to Tory as I returned to the inner caves. I'd mix it with ingredients of the medicine sack around his neck. The fungus would have to be crushed and blended into the sack's other ingredients to conceal it from Dionysius's skilled eye. Of course, the more I handled the fungus, the more it increased my exposure to its vapors. I'd have to be quick and work in the tunnels where the constant breeze would vent the vapors away from me. The next few hours would unveil how successful my plan would or would not unfold.